This is KM Wyland, and you are listening to the 369th episode of the Helping Writers Become Authors podcast. My big news this week is that I reached the midpoint in my outline for my Portal Fantasy sequel, Dreambreaker, and only about 2 months behind schedule, too. Without doubt, this has turned into the most extensive and in-depth outline I've ever done, mostly because it's the first I've ever written that's part of a series, which is what we're going to talk about in today's podcast. Fortunately, it's also been, without doubt, the most fun and rewarding outline I've ever worked on, too. I'm hoping to finish it up in another couple months and start in on the first draft by spring, which is only 4 months past my original goal. For now, I have to stop for a few days to transcribe the last quarter of my outline before too much time passes and I can't translate my handwriting anymore. The latest post on my blog is Boba Fett's Guide to Writing Cool Characters. Learn 2 surprisingly easy ways Star Wars: The Empire Strikes Back made Boba Fett unforgettable, and how you too can create cool characters. To read the post, visit my site at helpingwritersbecomeauthors.com. And now I hope you enjoyed this week's podcast entitled How to Outline a Series of Best-Selling Books. Every good series has to start somewhere. If you're of the mindset, as I am, that a problem as complicated as the novel is best approached from the big picture view of an outline, then it only makes sense that the even greater complexities of serial fiction will benefit even more when their authors understand how to outline a series. These days, books run in packs. The vast majority of authors are writing sequels and series. Aside from the fact that series are fun and offer the opportunity to return to beloved characters and settings, they're also a smart marketing decision. Hook readers with one book, and they're likely to return for the rest of the series. Easily the most frequent follow-up question I've gotten over the years to my book, Outlining Your Novel, is how to outline a series. And I've hedged and hawed on that, offering a few logical suggestions here and there. But up until now, it isn't a subject I felt qualified to write about since I'd never written a series. And I'm glad I waited. Last year, I began my first ever series when my originally standalone Portal Fantasy Dreamlander turned into a trilogy on me. Outlining the follow-up books has been an entirely different, multifaceted, and incredibly rewarding experience. Figuring out the real-time steps of how to outline a series has exploded several of my preconceptions about the process and taught me much more about outlining and storycraft in general. So, are you ready to find out how to outline a series of books you'll be proud of and readers will love? Let's get started. Should you outline the whole series or one book at a time? This is probably the most common question I receive about how to outline a series. Obviously, my approach to the Dreamlander trilogy has been a little wonky since I wrote and published the first book with no intention of following it up. I outlined the first book with no idea there would be sequels, and now that I am outlining the sequels, the first book in the trilogy is already set in stone, and I only have to worry about the remaining 2. The approach I'm finding works best is basically the one I've been recommending all along. Outline the overarching story up front, but not all the books. The whole point of outlining, whether you're working on a standalone or a series, is that you discover the story's end so you can then appropriately set up the beginning. This is arguably even more true of a series in which the big picture resonance of the overall plot and theme will be even more hotly anticipated by patient readers who sometimes wait years for the payoff in the end. The secret of tremendously powerful and popular series is that the ending is always present in the beginning. Authors such as J.K. Rowling knew how the story would end right from the beginning. However, this does not mean you need to write a complete outline for each book in your series right at the start, especially if you're like me and your outlining process is in-depth and detail-oriented. It may actually be counterproductive to hammer down all the details of your later stories until you've written the earlier ones. An outline, however thorough, is never the final story. many important details will inevitably change during the writing of the first draft. As Josip Novakovic says, the plot outline is like a game plan in basketball or football. It can look good on the chart, but once the ball flies, it does not suffice. The plan is not sacred. It shifts depending on the position of the players on the field and on the flight of the ball in the wind. So if too many of those change details pile up, you may find the original outline you wrote for book 3 or book 4 suddenly doesn't work. As you're working your way through your story's plot holes, figuring out where events are going and what your character's transformation will be in the end, you should end up with an overall picture of your series arc. And it's good if you have an idea of at least the shape of each of the 3 acts in your planned follow-up books. Keep track of the big moments you discover, which may turn into your major plot points in later books. Beyond that, you only need to explore further books insofar as you have questions about them that affect your current book. So go ahead and finish this book's outline and first draft. After that, you'll have a solid foundation for the books to follow, and you can dive into their individual outlines one by one. Another question I frequently hear is, how can I keep the main conflict going in my series without making the individual books feel incomplete? And this is an excellent question because there's little readers detest more than stories that cliffhang them for no good reason. Now, it's important to differentiate between a cliffhanger that hooks readers into the next book, which we'll talk about in the final section, and a cliffhanger that suddenly leaves all of the book's conflict questions unanswered. Even within a series that features a focused overall plot, each episode within that series must be complete unto itself. Otherwise, you risk reader frustration. Why did they spend 6 hours reading this crazy book if they don't get to find out what happens? Your overarching series will have a dramatic premise of its own. The protagonist's main goal within the plot and main lie within the theme will not be resolved until the climax of the last book within the series. However, each book within the series must also have its own mini dramatic premise. The protagonist will not reach his main plot goal until the end of the series, but she will definitely gain or lose the individual plot goals she is seeking within each story. For example, Jack Aubrey and Stephen Maturin's overall goal in Patrick O'Brian's Aubrey Maturin series is to defeat Napoleon. The series goes into the double digits without them accomplishing this. Each book, however, features its own dramatic premise centered around a specific plot goal, which the characters either definitively succeed or fail in reaching. Each book feels complete unto itself, even as the overall story keeps on trucking. And this is even more important within a series that does not feature a prominent overarching plot. In a series that is more episodic in nature, such as some romance and mystery series, each story essentially functions as a standalone, even though a few subplots may continue from book to book to tie it all together. How should you structure your series? Each book within the series will, of course, maintain its own proper adherence to the pacing of the main structural beats. But what about the larger story? How can you structure that over the course of multiple books? And this is where I had to challenge some of my preconceptions about outlining a series. I've talked previously about how you can simply divide the number of books in your series into the overall structure to figure out where to place your main structural moments. For example, in a trilogy or a quartet, each book can essentially function as either one of the acts or one of the quarters of the overall structure. Now, while this approach isn't wrong, I'm learning it's pretty simplistic. The overall story structure will usually not line up quite so neatly book by book in a big, complicated series that features multiple turning points, perhaps multiple character arcs, and possibly an uncooperatively uneven number of books. So what I discovered was that figuring out how to outline a series is where a solid understanding of structure becomes even more useful. because you can no longer rely so heavily on the easy timing equations of a single book structure. You must step beyond the facts and into the theory of structure, using your own story instincts to determine how best to control the emotional flow of the overall series. For example, in a trilogy, you're usually going to find the following. Book 1 functions as a setup, an origin story of sorts, in which the protagonist first encounters the main conflict and probably experiences an early victory. Book 2 is the descent into the darkness of the conflict, in which the protagonist is often temporarily overcome, facing a dark moment of defeat. Book 3 then signals the climactic period, in which the character rises from his defeat into his final heroic pose. Now, that said, you definitely still want to make sure your major structural moments are obvious within the overall flow of the story. The middle book should feature an obvious midpoint that signals a shift into the full-on conflict of the second half, as we see, for example, in Goblet of Fire. In a trilogy, the second book will often end with the low moment of the overall story's third plot point. But remember, of course, the third and final book will still feature its own complete structure with its own individual third plot point. Now, the timing will depend entirely on how many books you're featuring, which is yet another reason outlining your overall story idea in the beginning is incredibly helpful. Here's another question I hear. Can your protagonist follow more than one character arc over the course of a series? Originally, I thought, nah, it's an overarching story, right? So there should be an overarching character arc. That may be true, but it's not quite as simplistic as it looks on the surface. As I dug into character arcs for my sequel, Dreambreaker, I realized one of the characters would be demonstrating a different arc in each of the 3 books. I wanted this character to ultimately follow a positive change arc, but along the way, this character first had to follow 2 different types of negative change arcs. A disillusionment arc in book 1 and a corruption arc in book 2 before finally being able to enter a positive arc in book 3. Another character, however, clearly followed an overarching positive arc over the course of all 3 books, while still overcoming individual lies and truths in each book. Just as your series will have an overarching dramatic premise to guide its plot, it will also have an overarching thematic premise to guide its theme and your characters' arcs. You need to know right from book 1 where your characters will end up in book Z and what truth their end will be proving. However, just as structure is surprisingly flexible within the overarching story of a series, so are character arcs and theme. Pay attention to what feels right and allow your characters to follow logical paths of light and darkness on their way to their final climactic encounter. What's important is making sure your character's ultimate end in the final book is foreshadowed in the beginning. The last thing you want is for your character's redemption or fall to come out of the blue. It needs to be a steady progression of everything that's happened to him. Unfortunately, in a series, you have all kinds of space in which to explore and develop this inner journey. In my exclusive Word Players group on Facebook, which you can find out how to join on my website at helpingwritersbecomeauthors.com, Vicki Owens asked me, how should you connect book 1 and book 2 in a series? I'm looking for how to end the first book in the last chapter, create a hook or something, and start the first chapter in the second book. As I touched on briefly earlier in this episode, one of the keys to a solid series is making sure each book is a solid episode within that series. Each book's individual plot and its loose ends must be tied off within itself. However, that is still going to leave hanging the loose ends from the main overarching plot. The protagonist will have reached his mini goal for this episode, but his big plot goal is still out there beckoning. The main antagonist is still out there leering in the darkness. There's plenty of unfinished business. And that is what you use to hook readers into your next book. Your individual book's climactic moment will have answered its individual dramatic question. You can then use that book's resolution to tie off the loose ends remaining from this individual plotline. What you get to do then is to, in essence, raise the next book's dramatic question. Ask yourself what aspect of the main conflict will be most pressing in the next book, and what will be the individual main conflict in the next book. These are both questions you can use to create a hook of uncertainty that will grab readers' curiosity and pull them right into the next adventure. Consider how Thor: The Dark World ends with the antagonist Loki on the throne of Asgard. His presence there doesn't affect the resolution of that individual story's plot questions, but it does raise a whole slew of questions for the next story. As I'm discovering, figuring out how to outline a series is a tremendously exciting and fun challenge that takes the principles of storytelling up to a whole new level. As useful as outlining is when writing a standalone book, it becomes vastly more so in creating a cohesive and powerful series that grabs readers from installment to installment and resonates deeply in its final resolution. So, are you up to the challenge? Thank you for listening to the Wordplay Podcast. To read a transcript of this episode, you can visit my website at helpingwritersbecomeauthors.com. And be sure to check back again next week.